Well, good morning. It's good to see you today. If you've got a Bible, you may want to open it to Luke chapter 15. We'll be there in a few minutes in a very familiar parable this morning. If you're visiting, we're glad that you're here. You're in a good place. You're among a family of people that loves God and is trying to help others come to love God. And so if you're visiting today, I hope you'll want to stay around and get to know some folks. That attendance card thing confuses me because I'm not sure which card I need to fill out. I'm sort of a visitor and sort of here a lot, and so it confuses me. So I end up not filling out a card, but anyway, I may be on the bad list because of that. I want you to think back with me to the last time that you had a flat tire on your car. One of the most frustrating things that can happen, because there is never seemingly a good time to have a flat tire. It always seems to happen at one of the worst possible times that it possibly could. I remember one time years ago in Atlanta, I found myself after work on the inside lane of the interstate, rush hour traffic, changing a flat tire on my truck in a suit, no less. These kind of clothes are not made for changing tires. And in fact, these kind of clothes are not made for a lot of things, but we still wear them. But they're definitely not made for changing flat tires. And isn't it interesting that if you walk out in the parking lot today after church, I hope you don't end up with a flat tire, but if you do, you may have lunch plans, you may have other plans, but getting that corrected, getting that fixed, it really becomes your dominant priority. It takes over everything. Until that's taken care of, you can't move on to the next thing. I remember several years ago, it was a Saturday evening, much like yesterday, nice day out, and so after supper, we decided we wanted ice cream, and we drove over to Sonic, and we're sitting in the Expedition, we're waiting on the ice cream to arrive, and I noticed that the low tire light had come on, and so I thought, well, that's kind of strange, but I thought I'll get out while we're waiting on the ice cream, I'll figure out which tire it is, then on the way home, we'll air it up, because I was traveling the next day, we've got to get this dealt with. Well, I get out of the Expedition and I walk around, and I don't have to try to figure out which tire it is. I can actually hear the air coming out of the tire, and so my priorities changed. The ice cream arrived about that time, and I didn't take time to eat it. I raced across town because I wanted to change that tire in my driveway at home rather than on the side of the road. You understand how this works. Now, there are also some implications to a tire that's flat. Coming up on the screen now, you have a picture of my favorite car. That is a 1990 Ford Mustang LX 5-liter. I loved that car. It was a lot of fun. I wish in many ways that I still had that car. My wife said when I was going to sell the car, she said, don't sell the car. You're going to wish you still had it one day. And she was right. She's almost always right. I loved that car. But there are some implications to a flat tire. Now, I had a flat tire in that. One I remember, I was in downtown Florence. I was in a hurry, and I turned a corner. I was turning to the right, turned too sharp, big high curve. I knocked the tire right off the wheel. Careless on my part. Here's the thing. You can have the hottest car out in this parking lot today, the fastest car, the car that'll go the furthest, the most potential, the most powerful. That car was not the most powerful on the road, but it would get me in front of just about anybody I wanted to be in front of. But here's the thing. You can have the fastest car, but if the tire's flat, the slowest car in the parking lot will eventually outrun you, because if you continue on a flat tire, a car will not live up to its potential with a flat tire on it. So you understand how this works. Oh, and here's some other things that are worth noting. When you do have a flat tire on your car, there are some things you would never do. Or if you did do them, people would laugh at you. You wouldn't go by the shop and arrive with your car that has a flat tire and say to whoever's working at the shop, I realize that I've got a flat tire, but what I really think I need to do to my car today is I think I need to paint it. My car is white, but I'd rather it be blue, and I think if my car were blue instead of white, my car would be a lot better off. We wouldn't do that. The other thing we wouldn't do is to arrive at the stereo shop with a flat tire on our car and say, I realize that my tire's flat, but what I'd really like to do today is upgrade my stereo. I want my music so loud that I'll never notice that my wheel is really grinding on the pavement as I drive down the street. We wouldn't do that either. And then there's one other thing we wouldn't do. My car with a flat tire is here in Decatur, Alabama. we wouldn't say, well, what I really think I need to do with my car to get it to a better place is I need to relocate my car. If I could get my car up to Florence, Alabama, my car would serve me better up there. We wouldn't do that either. And the last thing we would never do when we have a flat tire is simply ignore it. We cannot ignore it. We wouldn't ignore it. People would laugh at us as if we did. We just wouldn't do that. And so you understand where we're going with this, or maybe you do. But here's my question this morning. What is your flat tire? And I've got to tell you, the analogy that I'm using today, it's not original with me. I heard a guy ask this question once, and I was riveted because the question is so compelling. It's so confronting. It's the idea that in my life, what one thing in my life needs to get repaired, needs to get fixed more than any other thing. What thing needs to change in your life? And when I say your life, there's an implication there. See, if I hear this question or I think about this question, and the first thing that I think is, wow, I wish Marla were with me this morning so that she could hear this lesson. See, I may have already completely missed the point. If I'm thinking about somebody else that needs to fix their flat tire instead of thinking about the problems that I have in my own life, I might be a lot like that self-righteous Pharisee that Jesus talked about, the one who was praying that he was so happy that he wasn't like the tax collector guy that was praying next to him. Now, if you did think that, don't beat yourself up too much. Sometimes we do that. We're human. But please don't miss out on what we're trying to accomplish today as we stand in the mirror. It never works to meet God through the eyes or through the grid of thinking, I sure hope somebody else thinks about this message. Now, we talked about some things we would never do with our car when it's got a flat tire on it. But the truth is, people, sometimes those of us who are trying to have a relationship with God, sometimes we do similar things when it comes to, I've got a glaring problem in my life, but instead of addressing the glaring problem in my life, I'll choose to work on something else. Like a car with a flat tire, I decide to go paint the car. Sometimes if I could just change my look, or if I could just change my wardrobe, we know we've got all these glaring issues, but we will work on the external. We'll try to make ourselves look better and feel better and all those sorts of things while never addressing the real issue. Or like that stereo upgrade, I'll trick my life out with all the gadgets that life has to offer. Stuff makes me feel better. I'll do all these things to distract me and to keep my attention away from what I really need to be working on. Or like relocating my broken down car to another location. Sometimes I realize that there are problems in my life, things that I need to work on, but instead of choosing to work on whatever it is, I'll choose to take my life to another location. I'll move my problems, and that is the thing. If I haven't worked on the issues in my life, I can relocate, I can go somewhere else, but I bring all of those problems with me if I haven't worked on them. And so as we set this up, maybe you're feeling overwhelmed this morning. Maybe as you think about life and you think about things that are going on for you personally, maybe you're a bit overwhelmed thinking, well, hey, I don't have one flat tire, I have 4. But here's the thing. God has positioned us for success. God has loaded us with potential. He's loaded us with the ability to accomplish great things for Him. And the good news is, when we get out of position, when we have those things in our life that derail us in some way, there's a way back. That's the big message from Luke chapter 15. And so our text is a familiar one, and I want to begin this morning in that text in just a moment. Through the text, we want to see how positive change can begin to take place in our lives, and we've got 3 points that we want to make in talking about this. If I want to realize positive change in my life, if I want to deal with whatever the flat tire is in my life, the number one thing I've got to do is I must see change as being something that's necessary. I told you about changing that tire on the interstate in Atlanta during rush hour. And I remember that day very vividly. Gil Gillis, he carpooled with me, and so we're rolling along, and it's stop and go. You move a few feet and you stop. And so Gil looks to the right out the passenger side window, and he says, Philip, this woman, she's trying to get our attention. She's motioning, she's pointing at your truck. And so Gil rolls the window down, and she says, your tire, it's just almost flat. See, we didn't know it yet. It was going down, but it hadn't gotten so far low that we couldn't tell. Spiritual side note here, when that lady pointed out my problem, it did not offend me. In fact, when she pointed out that I had a problem, I was actually thankful that she pointed out that I had a problem, because then I knew what I needed to work on. I knew I could pull over, get that fixed, and not eventually be stranded with a car that was completely torn up. Same thing for spiritual flat tires. If we ignore the problem, we run the risk of ended up being stranded spiritually, and that's kind of what happens to our guy in Luke chapter 15. Notice some of the verses. And he said, this is verse 11, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country, and there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? We know this parable. We've heard this story over and over. You've got a young man who walks away from a great relationship, and he ends up in a place that he does not belong. And then lo and behold, wouldn't you believe, there's a famine that arrives. And that famine is worth thinking about a little bit. I can put myself in positions to succeed. I can put myself in positions where hopefully I'll be more successful. I can put myself in situations that are perilous, that are potentially troublesome, but I cannot control what happens to me, and I cannot control what happens around me. Had this young man stayed at home, had he not left, in that foreign land there would have still been a famine. That famine would still have occurred, but had that young man been at home, had that young man stayed where he should have been, that famine would not then have affected his life. Had he not squandered his wealth. Now, you can choose to leave. He could have gone out there. Had he not squandered his wealth, then that famine that arrived that he could not control, that famine would not have had the impact on him that it did had he not made a bad choice. Because in the end, he could not have been less prepared for a bad circumstance. And in the end, he arrives at rock bottom. You've heard it said, he's a Jew. He's feeding pigs, and not only is this Jew feeding pigs, this Jew is actually wishing he could eat what the pigs are eating. That is rock bottom in this parable. It's the ultimate flat tire. And the key verse of the parable obviously is in verse 17, when he says, or when the parable says, when he came to his senses. It took hitting rock bottom for this young man to realize this may be the way things are, but this isn't the way things have to be. And so at rock bottom, he sees the need to change. One of the challenges for us, a lot of our problems and a lot of the things that we need to fix in our lives, they're not rock bottom issues. They are not the things that leave us in a pig pen wishing we could eat the food that the pigs are eating. A lot of times we don't hit rock bottom, and because of that, sometimes we don't see that crucial need to make a change. But the first step in overcoming any kind of problem is the idea that I've got to be willing to admit that there is a problem. And so for all of us, whatever it is we walk through, whatever it is that challenges us, we would do well to stop mislabeling the things that go wrong in our lives, the bad choices we make. What this guy's going to do is he's going to end up saying, I have sinned. Sometimes we don't like to say that. Sometimes we don't like to put the sin label on our bad choices. We'll say things like, well, I'm dealing with an issue. I'm facing some challenges right now. This is something going on in my life, and I'm praying through this right now. when the tire on my car is flat, do I pray about the tire, or do I get the jack out of the trunk and begin to change the tire? We need to be prayerful people, but there are times where what we need to be doing is taking action. And so in our parable, this broke, hungry guy, he's finally able to label his flat tire when he says, I'm going to go to my dad, and I'm going to say to my dad, I have sinned. The second thing we got to think about is the idea of taking responsibility. And we see that in the parable. And as we set this up, there are some other things about flat tires that we ought to be reminded about. There are several ways that my tire on my car can end up flat. Number one, I can flatten my own tire. Now, we don't normally do that on purpose. We don't normally go out and drive a nail into the side of our tire just to see it go flat. But we can be careless. That was me turning the corner in downtown Florence too sharp. I wasn't paying attention, and I flattened my own tire because of my carelessness. Or I can just neglect my vehicle. If I don't maintain it and if I don't take care of it, eventually my vehicle will strand me. I just haven't been taking care of it. Now, sometimes we'll do that with our spiritual health. We may be in church every Sunday, but for whatever reason, we're neglecting spiritual health. And eventually, we'll be stranded. Or I can take my car and I can drive my car in places that it was not designed to go. The car that I'm driving today, it's great for here to Russellville, but it's not designed for off-road driving. And if I take that car off-road, eventually that car is going to strand me because that's not where that car is supposed to go. And isn't it funny? It's not funny, it's sad. Famous people make the news when things go wrong. Have you noticed that? And have you noticed how when famous people have things go wrong, it's not famous person sitting in Wendy's at 12:30 eating a hamburger and something goes wrong in his or her life? That's not how it ever works, is it? It's usually famous person, it's about 3 a.m., they've come out of a bar, and then bad things happen. Have you noticed that? When people put themselves in places that they ought not to be, things are more likely to go wrong. So I can flatten my own tire, or somebody can flatten my tire for me. When I was in school in Nashville, I worked at a place called ComCheck one school year while I was there. It was kind of like Western Union, except we catered more to just trucking companies, so we were on the phone all day. Well, one Saturday, I'd worked all day, and very stressful. It's just one phone call right after another, but I was excited. I had a date that night, and so I came out of work, and I bounded around the side of the building, ready to go, and my hubcaps are gone. Now, this is the 80s when wire wheel covers were, all the rage. Your car really looks naked when the wheel covers are gone. Well, I get out there and I'm a little frustrated, and then I'm even more frustrated because I look, and as they're pulling off one of the hubcaps, they'd cut a valve stem, and not only was I without hubcaps, I had a flat tire. Very frustrating. Sometimes that happens. And sometimes people do things in life that bring pain. Sometimes people make choices that bring hurt. Sometimes people mess us up spiritually. The third thing is simply circumstance. Sometimes bad things just happen. That contributing factor in Luke 15, this young man, it's the famine. In fact, this young man, he really combines all three. He's not where he's supposed to be. He's careless. And then the famine occurs. That life circumstance just happens, and it leaves him stranded. Here's the thing. No matter why my tire is flat, if my tire is flat, it is my responsibility to take action for working on the problem that is the thing that's wrong in my life. It is my responsibility. You ever seen someone avoid taking responsibility? Has that someone ever maybe been you in a moment? And don't get me wrong, I realize we all have bad circumstance stories. We all have stolen hubcap stories. We all have the taking the car in places it wasn't designed to go stories. We've all got some of those as well. But when things go wrong, are we ever tempted to find someone or something to blame rather than taking responsibility? You think about this young man in our parable. He could have blamed his dad. Dad, why did you not protect me from me? When I came and I asked for my stuff, why did you give it to me? That was the worst thing you could have done. He doesn't blame his dad. He doesn't blame those people who helped him waste his money. When you've got money, you've got lots of friends, do you not? And he had plenty of people who were very happy to help him waste everything that he had. He didn't blame them. He didn't blame the famine. Why did God throw a famine on me? Everything I'm going through right now, and then God throws a famine on me to top it all off. He doesn't do that. He doesn't blame the people who, as he's going through his deepest, darkest time, he doesn't blame the people who still had money and who weren't choosing to help him out. He doesn't blame those who'd employed him for not paying him more. He does none of those things. Go back with me to the parable, again from verse 17. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I'm dying here with hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I'll say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.' So he got up and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him." The question is, when things go wrong, do we blame or do we take responsibility? You know, what happened here, that was their fault, and if this is going to get resolved, they're going to have to take the first step. They're going to have to make the first move forward. Sometimes we'll say things like, "Well, I was born this way. This is who I am. I can't help myself." Well, generally the problem isn't that we were born a certain way. We were born into a messed up world, and we learn to be messed up. That's generally what's happened. And I love what I heard one preacher say. He said, "You may think you were born that way, but the message of God is that you were not reborn that way. We're born anew." And as cold as it may sound in the end, it doesn't matter how my tire got flat. The answer is I must take responsibility. I cannot do life with a victim mentality. It's said that people who walk with a victim mentality never walk in victory. Number 3 this morning, if I want to affect positive change in my life, I've got to have a mindset that as it comes to living my life before God, that I am going to live obediently. Notice again verse 21 of the text. The son said to him, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." The son's problems began when he stepped away from the relationship that he had with his father, a loving father who's blessed him. We have a loving father who's blessed us with freedom. He's blessed us with the ability to make choices, and he wants us to choose to stay in that relationship with him. But just like this father in this parable allowed his son to walk away, our Father will allow us to do that too. For the flat tires that we face spiritually, how far would obedient living go toward helping those things be corrected, and maybe some of those things never going wrong in the first place? And before we finish today, I think it's appropriate that we drill down one more level. We've been very generic for the last few minutes. We've talked in generalities, the flat tire, the spiritual issue, the thing that's gone wrong. But sometimes I believe there's value in putting a name on some of those things that strand us, potentially strand us spiritually. What is your flat tire today? You know, for some, maybe it is the person you're dating. You know, sometimes we'll talk with the young people about it. It's really important who you date. Sometimes we get on into life and we're living as single adults, and it's still really important the person you date. You know, if the person I'm dating is not spiritual and they're not interested in heaven and they're not interested in helping me get there, if that person that I'm dating becomes my flat tire, because that person I'm dating has lots of influence in my life. Maybe it's one of the people in my inner circle. We all have one. We all have people who have influence over us, friends, co-workers, people that end up being very close. And when I define an inner circle, I think in terms of the person who, when they have an opinion, I'm going to listen to it because I respect what they think. And sometimes we let somebody into our inner circle and their thinking's not spiritual and their thinking's not about God. And their advice isn't going to be the kind of advice that will help us be healthy spiritually. Sometimes the flat tire is somebody in my inner circle, and maybe I need to make some changes there. Maybe the flat tire in my life is a vice that I'm hanging on to, a vice that's very near to being an addiction. Or maybe my flat tire is an addiction. Maybe it is that porn addiction that you're probably not going to be able to overcome on your own. And you're thinking, well, if I reach out and if I admit that I need help for this addiction that I have, then it may mess up my marriage. Well, see, if you've got a porn addiction this morning, your marriage is going to suffer. And it's better to admit that now and to start working through the problem now rather than to let it go and go and go to the point that it destroys your marriage. Maybe your flat tire today is a marriage that's on the brink of failure. You know, we fight about everything and we're too prideful to get some help. There are people who can help us, but we can't admit that we've got a problem. Maybe it's a broken friendship where there has been some pride or some arrogance that has prevented me from going and trying to make things right. Sometimes we believe that we feel better when we hold on to anger and we hold on to resentment and we hold on to things that keep us out of relationship with people. And we've talked about it. Nobody wins when we live that way. Nobody wins. And if I'm going to hold on to anger and if I'm going to hold on to resentment related to another person rather than trying to work that out, it's evidence that the cross is no longer winning in my life at that point. Jesus placed this huge importance on being reconciled to people if you want to be right with God. Maybe, though, the flat tire is simply being too comfortable and too complacent. A lot of sermons likely being preached this morning about, again, the unrest in our nation, the unrest that we continue to deal with, the idea that people are just there's a level of tension right now that many of us haven't experienced in a long, long time. And it's almost as if the tension has become just a regular part of who we are. And I get kind of tired of it. I'm sure you get kind of tired of it. But see, the answer is we can't afford to be comfortable. We can't afford to be complacent. If the tension in our nation doesn't do anything else, it ought to motivate us to say, you know, maybe I've been comfortable and maybe I've been complacent and maybe I haven't been willing to stand up and talk about the real solution to all of these problems. But maybe the motivation that I need to walk out of here with is today the resolve that, yes, the reason we're emphasizing discipleship is because I need to follow and I need to share and I need to try to help somebody come to this relationship with Jesus. I cannot afford to be comfortable. I cannot afford to be complacent any longer. Maybe that's the flat tire today. In the end, though, we love this parable because of what we learn about God. We see God through this guy's father. The son made a decision. Yes, I walked away, but now I'm ready to come back. I'm ready to live obediently. If you don't accept me back, if I could just find a place as a servant, that would be okay with me. He comes back not really knowing how he'll be received, not really knowing how he'll be treated. The beauty for us is we can mess things up in our lives, but through Scripture, we understand how we'll be received and we understand how we'll be treated. This parable gives us some insight into that. Verse 21, the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him. And put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. In that father, we see restoration. We don't see probation. We see restoration and we see celebration. And that's the reason my flat tire needs to be addressed. And that's the reason your flat tire needs to be addressed. That father represents God, and that's God's reaction. If I've been away, when I come back, it's restoration, it's celebration. That's the way God treats us. That's what we celebrate. That's what we're excited about. And so I ask, do you have a flat tire today? And if so, what needs to change? All of us are a work in progress, a work in process. And for that lost son in that pig pen, that first step toward home, it was probably his most difficult but it was also his most important, because you must take a first step before you can take a next step. Maybe today your life is at a place where you realize you need to come home. You need to return to the Father. This church will love you and celebrate with you as God restores you. That's what families do. Perhaps you, as you think about life today, you realize things in my life are actually pretty good. I don't have any of these major issues that are troubling me today, and if that's the case, praise be to God. I'm thankful for that. But allow me to challenge you in one more way before Hinton comes and leads us in the song that he selected. If you've got the courage to do so, ask someone in your inner circle today if there's something that you need to work on in your life. Maybe you ask your spouse. Again, maybe one of your close friends who will tell you what you really need to hear. If you're really brave, as a parent, ask one of your children and ask them to be honest with you. Hey, is there something I've missed? Do I have a blind spot? Is there something I need to be working on in my life? If there's anything today that is preventing you from living with the power and the potential that God has instilled within you, that God wants to see in you, if there's something that's preventing you from living that way today, respond today and allow God to fix it. If you need to come, let it be known while we stand and while we sing.